Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Mansur Hasib, and welcome to another episode of Conversations with DrCybersecurity. And today, my featured guest is Alexis Perdereaux. Alexis, introduce yourself, please.
Steve, thanks for having me on the show. My name is Alexis. Our primary focus is on data privacy, security, governance, and risk. I'm a doctoral student that's working on the same program around data privacy, risk, and governance. Have a special interest in privacy and risk compliance around GDPR, CCPA, LGDP, and that's what my doctoral study has been about. Our primary work with organizations to help them manage risk. It is important to understand what the risk appetites are for those organizations, what controls they have in place, and how to be more proactive as it relates to protecting data. I think data is an important aspect of businesses today because it's an understanding of what value we can get out of data today. So a lot of organizations are working towards increasing not only their cyber footprint, but the opportunity of getting more value out of data. So as part of my day-to-day operation, that's what I do to work businesses to help them manage risk. And I'm happy to be on your show.
That is wonderful introduction, and
Awesome.
and congratulations on being so close to earning your doctoral degree.
One more semester, yes, sir.
Yeah, that's great. So what things do you want to talk about, Alexis?
So I want to talk to where the market is going. There's been a lot of changes from data privacy and risk, the whole concept of EU. There's been a lot of updates in the news recently around adequacy requirements around the UK. I know there's an expectation that later this week, that country would be deemed adequate. So there won't be a concern about data transfer between the EU and the UK. And just the whole differences in the perception in data. How do we differ within the US to EU to Brazil and other territories, how data is understood, and the whole roles of data brokers, the importance of establishing data ownership. I think one of the challenges in the market today, it's an argument between data ownership and data access, right? So I think that's one of those interesting topics that as an organization, we need to be able to better understand how we can prepare for that.
Yeah, because many of the people who actually are custodians of the data are actually thinking that the data belongs to them. But in reality, data, the way the privacy laws were written, the data always belongs to the person whose data you're holding. So whoever has the social security number, that's the person who owns the data. You are just the custodian.
Exactly. And I think that even if you look at the way a lot of business models are created today, I think there's an opportunity to understand how data is defined. The whole issue around governance and risk to data and the establishment of ownership of data. I think once you look at the issue around data ownership has been, if you go back to historical time where they try to understand property and what is deemed ownership from a property perspective. The research would indicate once you establish ownership, there is certain rights that goes along with establishing that you are the owner, as opposed to the conversation that you're seeing today, where most of it is around providing access to users to that data. So, you look at most social media focus today has been around those specific things, establishing that, okay, I would give you the right to be able to access your data at any given time, while from my perspective, I'm concerned about establishing that I'm the owner of that data. Because if you establish that ownership, then it's a totally different conversation. So where you may see most institutions may provide you an export of the amount of data that they have for you. Most regulations today require some of those organizations to be able to identify the type of data that they hold specifically for you as part of that regulation. Some go as far as establishing requirements around what you can keep, for how long you can keep that data, and other regulatory requirements that govern the way that how the data is actually processed. So there's a big distinction as it relates to that specifically. And I think as the value of data increase, you'll see that ownership kind of shift, because most of the regulations has been going towards that, giving the user the right to owning that data. And once that is established as a basis for governance, then I think it changes the whole dynamic as it relates to, when you go to an organization, you're not just concerned about understanding what they have, but what is the purpose of collection? What is the purpose of sharing? With whom are they sharing that data? Mm-hmm. And then the conversation becomes, if I own it, I can control how it's shared, mm-hmm. right? So, and I think that's where the market is going, as you see most of the states, at least in the US, moving towards an approach where customers are having more opportunity to be able to speak to that value, right? And most organizations start the process of collecting a lot of data. Half of these organizations you don't have a business relation with.
Correct. Right? And they collect far more than they ever need to give you just the service.
Yep. I think the challenge is that most people are not aware what is the required amount of data to collect to be processed. So you go to the store to purchase something, they ask for your zip code, right? Yeah. You swipe your card, they ask for your zip code. You automatically assume it's part of the process, but in fact it is not, right? It's just a way to kind of tag that data, yeah. And we identify you later through that same zip code, and now they have the credit card transaction. But it's so prevalent in the market today that the impression is that you think it's part of the transaction, right? When in fact it is not. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's important for customers to become more aware as it relates to data privacy practices, what is expected, what is the standard practice, what is required for you to do. In most of the organizations where I manage in a data privacy perspective in the past, mm-hmm. my concept has always been around only collecting that which is required. Mm-hmm. And then you hold it only for the purpose for which it was collected. Correct. And no time beyond that. So it is important, I think, to be able to better understand whether you're in a regulated or non-regulated organization, what is expected of you as it relates to how data is managed, what's privacy expectations. And then certain types of institutions have a vast amount of data. I've worked in healthcare in the past, mm-hmm. and imagine being at a healthcare where an entire family is born in the same city, mm-hmm. right? So you have the mother, the father, the kids, all that information is there. And now we try to understand why are they targeted. Because they target them because their data set is so large and they can cross-reference them with so many other institutions. Like if you get a data broker who has multiple types of data sets, mm-hmm. right? Today, we try to mask our data in many ways, but there are many organizations out there that, based on research, that there's so many ways to identify a large majority of, the US or, world population based on some of those data types as well.
But it almost seems like this problem cannot really be solved without the involvement of policy and legislation, right? Because as long as companies are allowed to get away with all kinds of nonsense, they will get away with it. Part of the problem has been that there has been lax implementation, lax enforcement, even in the privacy laws that already exist. So, for example, the HIPAA law in healthcare has existed for a long time, since 1996. Yep. It wasn't until 2010 or so that even some of the penalties and breaches notification rules were strengthened. Mm-hmm. But even then, I'm still not seeing big losses for companies, because it seems like companies can simply get away with just offering credit monitoring or something stupid like that. But the damage, look, there's been so many breaches. We are hearing of breaches all the time, and yet I don't hear of penalties. That's part of the biggest problem.
Well, I think, the penalty has one thing we've seen in the market, even from a HIPAA. Like when I was at the hospital, one of the things that we were concerned with, I always talk to leadership about the issue of protecting the brand, mm-hmm. and understand the cost of what it is required to protect that data. Mm-hmm. I think the intent of HIPAA, it was good in the sense that it was more sectorial. Mm-hmm. So it's specific to that sector. Mm-hmm. I think what we look at from the organization is trying to understand how does technology interface with that expectation of the requirement on the ground. Mm-hmm. Because from a HIPAA perspective, while there was concern about business associates and other institutions that have that data, a lot of that initial conversation was around identifying baseline procedures of what is expected. So when an auditor or a government organization come out and assess your institution, the first thing they look at is the adequacy of controls, right? They're going to ask, what was it that we had in place prior to an incident? Did you have adequate controls around security process, protecting access to medical records? And as long as you can prove that you had those established, then the ability to fine on some of those requirements, is adjusted, right? Sure. If you don't have anything in place, it's a difference between having policies and procedures and not follow them than not having anything at all.
Correct.
So if you can show that you have a mature process in place to kind of mitigate some of those risks to exposure, then when the government regulators come in to kind of assess your institution, you're finding that there's not so much. They also give you an opportunity to adjust your discrepancies or areas where you have weaknesses. So you may see a fine that may originally start out to be much larger, but after working with the institution, they may be able to put procedures in place to adjust in those areas where they are weak. We've seen that with GDPR as well. I think in our network recently, we've seen comments about, why is it we are not seeing as much fines from a GDPR perspective? And I think it's the same thing within that space, right? Where you go through the whole process of negotiating with an entity based on their lack of controls. And then eventually you get to a negotiated settlement. So you're not seen as much fine, unless it's egregious, where once the regulators come in and they can see you're totally not taking basic steps. And that in itself led to that breaching of your institution. But I think that's when you look at the regulation itself, when you do a comparison with the US and EU and Brazil, one of the things you see is the challenge between what is considered a sectorial approach to privacy, where there may be sectors where we do stuff from healthcare, they may do stuff from banking or finances, but in the US, you really don't have a federal law, right, that governs privacy. When you look at privacy from a GDPR perspective, it's more for fundamental rights. There are things that are fundamental rights that's in law that dictates what is expected and what is not expected. In the US, we have a system or environment that's built around data. So, and that goes back to our original comment about some of those institutions that you deal with that had nothing to do with a one-on-one relationship with you. And then that's why I think the healthcare is more or less a unique case, because we haven't really seen as much of the fines. But if you go to some of the institution that tracks those, there are some fines that come up, but not as much as you would anticipate based on the length of time that the law has been enacted since '96 as well.
So any final thoughts about solving the issues or anything like that? Is your dissertation somehow going to solve some things?
Well, my dissertation is about understanding the risk of consumer awareness. What is the awareness that data privacy regulation can bring to the forefront? I think in order for the regulation to be effective, I think as a user community, we need to be better informed of what is expected of the regulation itself. What is covered, what is not covered. So my research is looking at the impact of data privacy regulation on consumers' willingness to disclose their personal information system. So I'm trying to understand, if you're living in the EU and you need to make a decision about disclosing your data with a specific entity, do you consider the regulation? Do you understand that, well, because I'm an EU citizen, there is specific protection that's afforded to me? Same thing like in the US. And that goes back to the whole argument of an opt-in versus an opt-out type of data security practices. Because in the US, an institution will collect your data and use it unless you opt out, as opposed to in the EU, there's an explicit requirement around the consent to be able to do that. Same thing with Brazil as well. That's similar to follow that approach. And that's why I hope my contribution to the community might be able to fully understand and help us understand the effectiveness of some of these regulations.
Well, it was absolutely wonderful to chat with you and help you have you shed some light in this very important area. I think you're probably one of the few people that have talked about this whole topic of privacy. So it's wonderful that you're doing your doctoral work in that. And so thank you very much for coming on the show and chatting with us.
We appreciate your time. Thanks for the opportunity to come and speak. And I've been following you for a couple of years, so I look forward to continued support and contribution to the community.
Thank you.